Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. Today we're going to have a look at some questions and answers that have been sent in by viewers. The first one of which is, can I adapt vintage glass to my Nikon DSLR? That's really difficult. The Nikon distance, lens mount distance, if I show you on this camera, obviously this is a film camera, but the distance I believe is the same. The flange distance is very short on the Nikon cameras. That's to say that the back of the lens sits nearer to the sensor or the film than pretty much every other SLR. So that works fine if you're using Nikon lenses on Nikon bodies, or if you're mounting Nikon lenses to other DSLRs. But if you try and mount lenses that were made for other DSLRs that have a longer flange distance on a Nikon DSLR body, well, you're not going to be able to do it very easily. So if I just show you on this camera here, this is an old Zenit 3M, you'll see that this distance here is actually rather longer than it is on the Nikon body. It's probably not terribly clear, but that's how the situation is. And that does make it very difficult to adapt vintage lenses to Nikon DSLRs. I believe you can get an adapter with a built-in lens with an extra glass element that sort of squishes the image down and helps to focus it better. But then you're introducing extra elements and that will always degrade the image. Nikon DSLRs are very tricky to mount vintage lenses to. I believe it can be done with Canon DSLRs rather more easily, so Canon should be fine. I think Pentax are okay, though I'm not terribly sure of that. Do let me know if you know different, but Nikon, no, you just can't do it. The best cameras to use, in my opinion, for vintage lenses are mirrorless cameras. If I show you the Sony A7 here, well, you can see that a mirrorless camera, here's the mounting flange for a mirrorless camera, and you can see that that is very close to the sensor. It's smaller than the Nikon distance. It's a very small distance. I don't know how big it is exactly, but it means that when you want to adapt vintage lenses, you need to add length rather than take it away, if that makes sense. If you've got a mirrorless camera, that's any Micro Four Thirds camera, the Sony A7 or A9 series, any of the Fuji X series with interchangeable lenses, and the Nikon and Canon mirrorless bodies, yeah, you can mount pretty much any vintage lens onto those bodies. There are some exceptions. Occasionally you find lenses where the rear element protrudes quite a lot, and while it clears for a particular film body, it doesn't clear on a digital sensor. I think the Jupiter 12 might be one, I'm not sure. I know that has a protruding rear element. But a very small minority of lenses you can't mount to mirrorless. Pretty much any lens ever made, though, you can. Right, this is a question that comes up quite a bit. Where do you get your lenses? Well, I do buy a lot of lenses, but I don't have access to any sort of secret supply over and above what anyone else might have. What I do is I keep my eyes open for bargains on eBay, and they do come up. I recently bought a bunch of Pentax lenses, 3 beautiful old Takamine Pentax lenses. I paid £90 for them. They were actually worth far more than that. They've been sitting there on eBay for 3 months. Nobody wanted them. Why? I can't imagine. Quite a few lenses I've bought like that just nobody seems to want. Sometimes they're not terribly well photographed. and I've taken a little bit of a risk occasionally. Sometimes lenses aren't terribly well described, sometimes they're not terribly well photographed, and I've not been entirely sure what I was getting hold of. But it does work out in the main, and of course if a lens isn't as described, then you can always send it back. Another thing I do, so patience is one thing, another thing I do is I'll buy lenses that need cleaning. So I bought a Carl Zeiss Jenner Pancolar 50mm 1.8 with fungus, and I got it quite cheap, got it for about £30. Nobody really wanted it because it had fungus on it. It turns out the Pancolar is actually really easy to clean, and I was very lucky in that the fungus was only on the inner side of the front and the rear elements. There was no fungus throughout the rest of the lens. I've bought several Helios 44s that needed oil removing from the aperture blades, lubrication of the focus mechanism because they weren't turning right. That lens, the Helios 44, is a really, really easy one to service if you get yourself a lens spanner and you don't go in for any, full dismantling of focus helicoids and so on. If you just want to take the glass out, clean the glass, clean the aperture blades, it's really, really easy. And some lenses are very easy to do like that. Generally I've found that the older the lenses, the easier they are to clean, although that's not always the case. The Carl Zeiss Biotar that I've used in one or two of these episodes, that had fungus, and I bought it cheap with fungus, and actually that was a really tricky one to do, and I only just managed to get it back together. I did, to my eventual relief, get it back together, but it really wasn't easy. So there is a bit of a gamble involved in these things, but once you've opened a couple of lenses, you do kind of get the hang of what can I call the philosophy behind their construction, the way they're put together, and that tends to be reasonably common to a number of lenses, so practice definitely makes perfect. So yeah, that's my strategy for buying lenses. Of course, people have also been very, very kind and sent me lenses to review, and that's another fantastic source of material for the channel. But buying lenses, number one, have patience. Number two, if you can do a bit of cleaning and repairing, so much the better. Okay, another question that does come up quite a lot is, what camera do you shoot with? Well, occasionally I shoot some film, but it's always very clear on the channel when I do that. The camera that I use to take all of the digital shots with all of the vintage lenses, unless otherwise stated, is this one, the Sony A7 Mark I. And this is the ideal camera to do it. It will mount pretty much any vintage lens because it's mirrorless, and as many, if not most of you, probably know already, but I'll show you anyway, this camera has a full frame sensor, so that means that the sensor is the same size as a 35mm piece of film. Let's pop that back on. I don't want any dust to get in there. Yeah, so the sensor on this camera is the same size as a piece of 35mm film, which means that any vintage lens you mount on the camera will behave as the manufacturers intended. That is to say, the image will be the correct size, the lens will perform with the correct effective focal length, the minimum focus distance is going to be the same. Everything about the lens when used on a full frame camera is the same as when it was used on film cameras. There is an issue that's caused a little bit of contention, which is that when you mount lenses made for 35mm film on crop sensor cameras, the effective focal length is increased and the effective minimum focal distance is halved. Right? This has caused controversy because I think sometimes it just seems sort of like magic. It's not magic, it's just simple physics. The lens doesn't change, of course, when you put it on a crop sensor camera. Nothing about the lens changes. Here I've got a 50mm f2 lens mounted on a full frame camera. If I put this on a micro four thirds camera, it would still be a 50mm f2 lens. The lens itself is not magically transformed. However, the properties of the lens when used on the micro four thirds sensor are changed because the field of view is changed. The sensor looks through the central portion of the lens, so the image is effectively magnified. Please note that word effectively. It's not actually magnified, only effectively. The 50mm lens works as though it was a 100mm lens, and because you're only looking through the central portion of the lens, the image appears to be magnified. So I do hope that's cleared up what can be a slightly contentious issue. Right, here's a question that does come up from time to time, and various people have asked this question. Can you use a rangefinder lens on an SLR or an SLR lens on a rangefinder? Well, this is a very, very tricky thing to do, and the reason again comes down to flange distance, as we were mentioning earlier on. So here I've got a rangefinder camera. This is the Zorky 6 we used a little while ago in an episode, and we've got the Zenit 3M SLR. Now if I put them together, you can see, or you should be able to see, I hope you can see, that the lens on the rangefinder camera here at the top sits much nearer to the film than the lens on this SLR here at the bottom. So what that means is, if you wanted to use this SLR lens on this rangefinder, what you would have to do is find a way of making that SLR lens sit further forward. You could find the distance by careful measuring, that wouldn't be a problem. You could machine an adapter. I don't think there are any commercially available. You'd have to actually make one or have one made. But even then, you wouldn't get the focusing that you get with a rangefinder lens. It wouldn't actually work, the rangefinder, because in a rangefinder lens there's a little cam that moves outwards as you focus. That cam pushes on this little lever here. Don't know if you can see that, but there's a little lever there that moves just inside the throat, the lens throat, and that works the rangefinder, so that gives you your distance reading. So of course you wouldn't have that on the SLR lens, it just isn't there. That makes things tricky to begin with. And if you wanted to mount this rangefinder lens on this SLR, you would have to find a way of making this sit further back, which you can't do without very, very significant re-engineering to the camera. It just wouldn't be worth it. Next question is, can you recommend a good photo lab for colour developing? The answer is no, I can't, sadly. 20 years ago, the skills existed everywhere. You could pop down to your local branch of Tesco and they would develop photographs for you really nicely. Everything would be right, they'd be properly washed, there wouldn't be any scratches on the film, they'd all be nicely filed and stored in sleeves carefully. The skills were there, they'd been there for the past 100 odd years, and they were there. The skills I find now do seem to be dying out. Whenever I've taken rolls of colour film to be developed recently, by recently I'd say within the past 5 years or so, they've come back to me with scratches on the negs. They've come back with little bubbles on them where either the chemicals haven't been washed off properly or they've been left to dry properly, improperly. The skills just don't seem to be there anymore, and that's a real shame, but it is what it is, and perhaps we should expect that as time goes by and film remains very much less popular medium than digital. So I actually don't bother, personally I don't bother with colour film anymore. It's a shame, I like shooting on colour film, but it's much easier for me to just shoot black and white, develop it myself, scan it myself, and that removes any problems, apart from dust, which is a problem I'm still working with. I'm still trying to find a fix for getting dust off the negs or not letting dust come into contact with the negs at the scanning stage. But I'm sure I'll find a solution in time. That's my solution to shooting on film. I just do it in black and white, process it myself. And finally, we've got a question here. Do you do any post-processing on the images on the channel? The answer is no. They're almost all straight out of camera. I say almost because occasionally there are shots that I need to salvage. There was a shoot recently where I shot a roll of black and white film, and one or two of those shots were underexposed, so I did have to do a little post-processing work on those just to salvage them. They were nice shots, otherwise I didn't want to chuck them away, and I was able to just salvage what I could from them with post-processing. But in the ordinary way of things, no, I don't. The images that you see on the channel are straight out of camera, and they're the images that you'll get if you shoot on a similar camera. So no post-processing on the Zenography channel. And I think that's probably it. I can't think of any more questions that I've been asked recently that would be of general interest. So that's probably it for now. I will say before I go, thank you very much for getting us to 10,000 subscribers. In fact, we're now on about 10,400 subscribers. That is really gratifying, so the channel is continuing to grow. Thank you to everybody who's sent in lenses and equipment for me to review. It really is very much appreciated. So thank you very much for that. And we'll be doing many more lens tests in the upcoming weeks. We've got lots of vintage lenses waiting and ready to try and to shoot. So that's it from me for now, as usual. Thank you very much for watching, and please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. If you like the content on the channel and you want to support it and help it grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. Once again, thank you very, very much for watching. It's much appreciated, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.